class. I hope you guys are doing well. Praying for you all every day during this time. I know I see some of you on a daily basis as you're still on campus, but for those of you who are off, know that I am praying for you and I hope you're doing well. So today I just wanted to talk a little bit about archetype as we dive into Jack the Giant Killer, this fairy tale. Because there's an interesting archetype in this fairy tale that you may not be familiar with. We're familiar with some of the archetypes from fairy tales like the Wicked Stepmother or the Princess or something along those lines. But there's an interesting archetype in Jack the Giant Killer that I wanted to explore together before you dive into the story. So you guys may remember that I talked about this a little bit in class, but in case you didn't, Jack the Giant Killer is not the same story as Jack and the Beanstalk. There are a few similar elements, but the story is pretty different. There's actually a lot that happens. There's no beanstalk in this story, for one thing. But the confusion here comes because it involves giants, and the main character's name is Jack. And so, because of that, sometimes people think that these stories are the same. In fact, there was a recent movie several years back called Jack the Giant Slayer, which kind of takes elements of both Jack the Giant Killer and Jack and the Beanstalk and puts them together. In reality, the movie is really based more on the story of Jack and the Beanstalk than it is on Jack the Giant Killer. But that just shows you that a lot of people kind of conflate these stories, put them together, when they are, in fact, two very different fairy tales. Again, some of the confusion comes in that the main character's name is Jack, and this is because of an archetype, and that's the archetype that I want to talk about today. So I had you guys look at some videos and read some things about the term archetype and what it is. And in essence, an archetype is a constantly recurring plot, symbol, motif, or character in literature. And this appears in literature all around the world. These archetypes are not exclusive to one particular culture or region of the world. We see them all around the world. A classic example of this is the Cinderella Story, actually. There is a very similar story in many, many different cultures around the world, oftentimes involving feet, but not always. A glass slipper or a rose gold shoe or something of that nature. But the story is kind of around, and it is an archetypal story. It lives in the consciousness of kind of all of the world's people. And so the character of Jack is actually one of those archetypes. The character of Jack is this archetypal character that appears in literature from around the world. Jack in particular, the name Jack is kind of the name for the Cornish or English version of this type of character. So Jack is the name that comes from Great Britain. But we see a similar character in a number of other cultures that often has the same name in that culture in those fairy tales. Another English version of this is John. In the German, the archetype, this kind of character, is often named Hans or Hansel. In Russian, it's Ivan. There are some other cultures that have this kind of character as well. And I will mention one of those in particular when we get to the next slide. But so it is this archetypal character, this character that keeps coming back in various folk tales and fairy tales throughout literature, throughout time, throughout the world. We have this specific kind of character. They're not the exact same character. They may not have all the exact same personality qualities, but they have kind of these common personality qualities that make them an archetype, a character that we draw on. In many ways, a character model that authors continue to use is this kind of Jack sort of character, or as he's known by other names in other cultures. So The archetype of Jack appears in many different tales and nursery rhymes. We have the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, obviously, which we've been talking about, Jack the Giant Killer. Jack Frost is a Jack character, obviously very different from Jack and the Beanstalk or Jack the Giant Killer, but his core character is kind of the same. Little Jack Horner, from that nursery rhyme, This is the House That Jack Built. These are all kind of different stories where the character of Jack as an archetype appears with the actual name Jack. Then obviously we have other stories from other cultures where he has a different name but is kind of the same person. So what is the archetype of Jack or John or Hansel or Ivan? These characters all have these common character qualities that we can reference to show that they are this archetype character. One is that these characters are often lazy or foolish at the beginning of the story. This is not always the case, but almost always the case. There are very few exceptions to this. So usually the character is kind of this lazy, foolish boy kind of at the beginning. And they're usually somewhat mischievous. They often get themselves into trouble. They like to play tricks. But their cleverness or tricks, in addition to sometimes getting them into trouble, oftentimes gets them and others out of trouble. And so it's this cleverness or tricks that also distinguishes them. So thinking lazy or foolish at the beginning of the story, they're mischievous, but when trouble arises, they use cleverness or tricks to solve those problems, which means that they emerge triumphant in the end. This is the archetypal model of the Jack character. You may begin to think of some other characters that kind of fit this model. One of the most popular, actually, from a completely different culture, from the Arabian culture, is the character of Aladdin, or Aladdin, as his name originally was. Aladdin is a Jack character. Obviously, he has a different name. He comes from a different culture, but you will see that the archetypal model is the same. He's lazy and foolish at the beginning of the story. He is kind of mischievous, but he uses cleverness and tricks to emerge triumphant in the end, to get the princess, to defeat the magician. That is kind of the model of his story, and Aladdin is very much the same archetype as Jack. So, as you are thinking about all of this, just keep all of this in mind as you read the story and watch for this story pattern with the character of Jack. I think you will see some of these characteristics in the story as you read it. So pay attention to that because you'll want to answer some questions about that later. All right, guys, I hope you enjoy reading this particular fairy tale. And obviously, let me know if you have questions. Be in communication with me. Just enjoy the story and the work that comes after. See you later, guys.